Afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this important event. My name is Sophie McNeill. I'm the Australian researcher with Human Rights Watch and a former journalist with the ABC. So it's a real honour to be here with you today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us in this important event that will really educate us on how refugee leaders can play a bigger role in shaping a better world. And I'd like to start by just acknowledging that I'm speaking to you today from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people in Western Australia. I'd like to acknowledge their leaders, the Noongar elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Now, thank you so much to everyone who's joining us from around the world this afternoon. We have people joining us from Indonesia, Uganda, a very early start in London. We have a really dynamic presentation ahead for you this afternoon. Now, this is a joint Australia International Development Network webinar together with the Philanthropy Network for People Seeking Asylum and Refuge. So thank you to those two organisations for their support in making this happen today. Now, we're going to have questions at the end, so a little bit of housekeeping. The last half an hour will be dedicated to questions, so please make sure you have yours ready. And also just to note that Jessica Num from the Kachin Women's Association won't be joining us today, but she will have an event coming up in early 2021, so please keep an eye out for that one. So I'm going to start this afternoon by introducing two amazing women. Mujgan Moarefzadeh is co-founder of Refugees and Asylum Seekers Information Centre, RAIC. She's a founding member of the Jakarta Refugee Advocacy Network in Indonesia. Originally from Iran, Mujgan is a refugee law paralegal, a human rights advocate, and a public speaker. Through the RAIC, Mujgan and her colleagues provide support to refugees, including hygiene and food packages, eye and dental care clinics, a mental health program, and they provide refugees with a legal aid service. She's co-host of The Wait, which is a recently launched 5-part narrative podcast for The Guardian Australia, which examines the impact of Australia's border policies on refugees in Indonesia. And people last week were saying on Twitter that this is the must listen to podcast of the month, so make sure you check that out. Now, working with Mujgan is Anna Crowley. Anna's joining us from London, and she's an important ally of refugee-led organisations and is leading generational cultural change amongst the donor community by contributing to the Refugee-Led campaign globally. Anna is currently emphasising refugee leadership in COVID-19 response and recovery efforts through her London-based role leading the Open Society International Migration Initiative's Protection Division. She oversees advocacy and grant-making strategies that aim to enhance protection for refugees and vulnerable migrants at multilateral levels in Bangladesh, East Africa, and the Americas. Now, Anna and Mujgan are going to start by having a chat between the two of us to explain this new effort, Refugees-Led. Thank you, Anna and Mujgan, for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you to the Australian International Development Network for making this important opportunity possible, and to Anna Demont from the Planet Wheeler Foundation for support and partnership in bringing this webinar together and in other shared endeavors. We wanted to share the experience of the Refugees-Led campaign with this community of donors as a starting point for broader discussion about the kinds of support and refugee-led initiatives needed to build power and influence. Many of the panelists on the call were brought together first through their participation in the campaign, but they're naturally engaged in efforts beyond the campaign as well, which you'll hear about later in the call. The Refugees-Led campaign was a multi-sectoral coalition of some 25 organizations, refugee-led organizations, international NGOs like Oxfam and Amnesty, smaller NGOs focused on capacity building for refugee-led organizations, academics, and social enterprise. It grew out of a few key reflections early on in the pandemic by us and by several close partners, that while we were hearing a lot of emphasis about how important refugees were to response, we weren't seeing much action or change in how funding actually moved to them. That is, they were now absolutely critical to the pandemic response as they have been to refugee responses over decades, but for the large part, we're still not resourced to respond. So we wanted to take relatively visible and quick action to demonstrate that new pathways for how funding can be accessed were possible, and that supporters like the NGOs and academics really had an active and a proactive role to play in getting that message across and facilitating funding relationships. The goals of the campaign were to elevate the role of refugee-led groups in responding to COVID, to create a mechanism to generate direct funding and visibility for a handful of them, and also to mobilize a broader community of supporters for refugee-led action. The first sort of iteration of the campaign ran 6 months with some pretty notable successes, and there's a lot to build on from there. First, funding generated through this campaign supported humanitarian action in 10 countries, reaching nearly 85,000 people. Second, we collectively built a community of partners and allies with complementary skills and capacities, many of whom were new to each other. And that, I think, can be expanded and built upon. And I think most significantly, from my perspective, is that campaign partners really left their institutional interests at the door and recognized what is needed to make change in the refugee system. They were able to come together as allies around shared messaging about why refugee-led groups deserve support and why we will need to be allies, why we all need to be allies in mobilizing it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mojgan with a question. What, from her perspective, was the value of this campaign, and where does she think we can go from here?
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Sophie, for the introductions. Well, in my experience, this campaign has been quite different from all the different fundraising efforts that NGOs were trying to do together in the past years. I can see a change, in the direction that the philanthropy is going, and it was great to see that the Refugees-Led actually allowed us refugees to be center and front of the campaign and actually lead. And it was really amazing to see that alongside INGOs, some of the refugee-led organizations were also a part of the coalition of leading this campaign to support the rest of the refugee organizations who haven't been seeing much support. And through that, we helped each other connect to a larger community of donors and refugee-led, and understood about each other's works as well as knowing what type of support we need the most, and what are the places that the gaps are existing in different settings in different countries that otherwise we wouldn't been able to learn about and understand. So it's been a great opportunity to connect both directly, with donor communities, and also directly to other refugee-led groups outside of the country. It's been really unique because donors could directly get to know us and contact us and directly donate to us rather than going through, other channels and making the process quite complicated. So I think this is such a great, starting point in a change in philanthropy, and there's a lot to build on that. And so far, we have been getting positive response, and more people are interested in contacting us and learning from our work, which I think is great. So what we need is just support from the international community to build on that and not just leave it where it is now.
Thank you, Mojgan. And can you talk a little bit more about the importance of networking opportunities? Because one of the things we saw this as was really a networking opportunity and an opportunity to build a new type of partnership that's perhaps more enduring than some of the quick project-based partnerships or episodic partnerships that many RLOs experience.
Exactly, the networking opportunity has been really great because we could start conversations that is not just a one time, so we can build on all of those different programs that we are trying to develop. And normally we wouldn't be able to just contact people from across the nations and tell about our work. But now that INGOs has stepped in, it kind of creates a more important and clear image of the work that we are doing. And this network wouldn't just simply fade away because the conversation keeps going. And I think that's really important, and we shouldn't just leave it where it is.
Thank you, Mojgan. I think just in conclusion, before we hand it over to back to Sophie, we are really at the beginning of these efforts, and this was one attempt to innovate in terms of building a funding model. But I think there are many other ways to do this, and critical to the success of it was the coalition and building the coalition further, and adding new partners to Refugees-Led is something we're really keen to do over the next year, 2 years. And so I'd invite everybody listening to come forward with suggestions to join the effort, and to make the effort your own, because there are a lot of ways to do this, and there are a lot of ways to be part of a broader community that's advocating for these issues. Over to you, Sophie.
Thanks, Anna. Mushkan, just to go back to the work that you do on the ground in Indonesia, can you talk us through some of the success that the RAIC has had, particularly in the last 6 months during the pandemic?
RAIC has started as an information center, and we were mostly focused on legal aid, which is still a really large part of our program, and it's been really important, especially for refugees who haven't reached transit countries yet. So being able to connect, with a community of other refugees who are experiencing, the life that they might experience later on, helps them get in touch and make informed decisions. That's the first thing. And then second, for the refugees who are in transit countries, to receive legal aid is really important for them. But besides that, during the pandemic, we have been leveraging our basic needs programs, such as the food programs and also the hygiene packages, which massively helps the refugee community. As they say, they can't really get out and do things like before. So it's been really, really important, and requests keep coming, and we were thankfully able to support a large number of the community during the pandemic, and it has been really successful. And besides that, we are developing a mental health program to give the tools to the refugees themselves to be able to create a coping mechanism for themselves, and to be able to bring the awareness into the refugee community to be able to recognize if somebody has, for example, signs of suicide and depression, and be able to lift each other up by the tools that they're learning through cognitive behavioral therapy. So these are just a few of the programs. And then with medical support that we are doing for refugees, like dental care clinics and eye clinics, again, these are gaps that nobody else is really filling in the refugee community. So we were trying to put together, our efforts together with Indonesian professionals, and obviously funding from outside of the country, to be able to bring those services into the refugee community.
And what are the numbers that you're speaking about, Mushkan? How many people does RAIC and yourself assist?
So in Jakarta and surroundings, there are nearly 7,000 refugees, which we are getting help to all of them. But outside of Jakarta and surroundings, there are, in total about another 8,000 refugees, which are mostly under the care of IOM, International Organization for Migration. Our direct services can't really reach them because, we have limitations to travel and to, get the service to other cities. But our legal aid programs, our mental health program definitely reaches all those areas, including outside of the country.
And what kind of support has been most critical to the success of your approach, Mushkan, the refugee-led approach, and RAIC's work?
One of the most important things was the support of, lawyers from outside of the country, especially, and also from within Indonesia, to empower us and bring the knowledge to us from the national law, so that, refugees face a lot of issues in the country as well. So all of these supports together have been empowering us to create a really solid legal aid program to be able to help all those people. And then another thing is direct funding from NGOs who allowed us to do the programs the way we wanted to do it, without pushing their own agenda or pushing us to change our program. So it has been really helpful to develop it. But it obviously hasn't been enough, and that's why we're doing what we're doing now to be able to increase that.
And how many people work with you? How many other volunteers and people are on staff at RAIC?
Well, staff, we don't really have any staff because we never had funding to have a staff and hire people on RAIC's boards. There are Indonesian members of the RAIC's board, which are all lawyers that support the legal aid program. But besides that, all of the other programs run on volunteers only, and we have over 100 volunteers running the different programs.
And the feedback you get from your clients, tell us what is the most meaningful program that IC runs that has really become a valuable part of their lives?
So the first thing is the legal aid program. I mean, everyone knows me as a legal aid person, but more important than that is the basic needs programs, to shelter people and to bring them, opportunities to be able, to have food and to be able to sustain themselves and have hygiene programs. In the beginning, I wasn't thinking that this was very important to them because I was really against the idea of giving fish to people, but then they're not really allowed to do anything else here in Indonesia. Livelihood opportunities are unavailable. People are not allowed to work. So this has been really important, and we are seeing that this community that we are supporting, they are also having the opportunity to get up and get out and go to learning centers and start learning different things and even create their own refugee-led initiatives.
And Mushka, what's your advice to interested donors in terms of considering how they might restructure their programs and support to ensure that a refugee-led approach is front and center and that they're supporting a young refugee leader like yourself?
The challenges that we are mostly facing for funding is that, one, it's really difficult to get funding to refugee-led initiatives because a lot of refugee-led initiatives don't have the opportunity to get legally registered in Indonesia, although we were one that were fortunate enough to be able to do that. It took 2 years, a very difficult process, but still it's been really difficult to be able to establish ourselves as, a professional organization that can actually lead, that can actually bring all the support that we are promising to the refugee community, and that, we can be professional just like any other NGOs. So my advice would be to have more flexible, regulations for funding, because one of our biggest challenges that we are not able to receive larger funding is that the requirements are just so much and they are outside of our capacity. Like, as an example, we were reaching out for funding and we were applying. Our program didn't have any problem, but one of the requirements was to bring a paper from the government of Indonesia to, support our work and to qualify us to get that grant, which obviously is impossible. Indonesian government wouldn't be able to do that. They are even unaware of, most of the programs that we are running because it's not a priority. So my advice would be having it a little bit, easier, and also being able to, collaborate with different INGOs to hopefully be able to receive those fundings. And another thing would be to allow more flexible funding, to allow for, salaries, the staff, rents, to be able to make us able to, develop all of these different programs that we are doing. Otherwise, we will stay small and grassroots forever.
Mushka, we're going to come back to you in the questions. I know a lot of people will have them, and I again recommend you check out the podcast, which is called The Wait, which has just come out in the last few weeks with The Guardian. Mushka, thank you so much. Please hang around. And I'm really honoured now to introduce John Geldark. John is joining us today from the Ugandan capital, Kampala, and home for him is the Rhino camp, where 100,000 South Sudanese refugees live. Now, John is the founder of the Youth Social Advocacy Team, YSAT, which is an organisation advocating for peace, youth empowerment, education and innovation in the camp. During the COVID-19 pandemic, YSAT is sharing information and raising awareness across Rhino Camp. They're distributing food, hand washing facilities and other essential items, as well as advocating for increased support to refugee-led organisations from the international community. YSAT is also leading a campaign calling for 1 million masks for refugees in Uganda, because at present, the Ugandan government is only providing masks for nationals, not to the 1.4 million refugees who live in the country. And John recently published a really powerful op-ed as part of Refugees-Led. The title of that piece was "They Have to Give Us Our 100% Food Ration Back." And it describes the devastating results of funding cuts and the impact that it has had on his home, Rhino Camp. Now, John, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Can you hear me, John?
Hello. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a cool breeze morning in Uganda.
Well, we're so pleased you could make it. Just to start off, before we go more in depth into your work, John, what motivated you to to found this particular organisation, YSAT?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sophie, and everyone listening. One critical thing that we always think about young people is that these are people, when we bring them to the table, they won't present to us anything. This has been the stereotype that we all have, whether you are a donor or government. A little bit of the background why I was motivated is that in 2013, I was displaced by the South Sudan conflict. Became a refugee in Uganda, a conflict that I wasn't even supporting any political party. By that time, I was just in school. I was in my high school. And then because of my ethnic affiliation to the opposition, by virtue of being from the Nuer community, I was a target. And there was a very specific statement that the president said, that he will not allow the 1991 problem to happen again. In 1991, I was not born myself. That is a hate speech. That is something that has been ruining my country for so long. And so when we came to this settlement in Rhino Camp, as in Uganda, we saw a repeat of that. People being settled in line of, your tribe, your region, the language that you speak. And that was already a threat, because if it is what has spoiled our relationship for over 21 years, and then it's following us up to the settlement where we're seeking for safety, then our future was doomed. That was really one thing that inspired me to really say, no, we have experienced this violence. We don't want someone following us to experience the same. This is one. The second motivation that we have is, when you think of a refugee, the perception that host communities in Uganda had was, these are people who are desperate. These are not human beings. These are people who are going to come and, take all our resources. We need to reshape this. We needed to communicate. We needed an advocacy, a tool that can communicate to people that, hey, we're human beings. We are same people, same color, with, the same blood, and that we have the same skills. We actually have doctors, we actually have engineers, we actually have, teachers who are just displaced by the conflict. And so for us to change the narrative of, the notion of looking at refugees as burdens, but not just partners, was one thing that compelled us, a group of 5 young people, to come together and say, you know what, let's have, social advocacy team. And this was actually the main core. Of course, the last part of us, which is core to our work, is, use as peace partners. Many a times when people go for peace dialogues and what, you leave young people very far. But when you're looking for your government or you're making your revolutions, you bring them closer, actually to the forefront, that you remain in your hotels in Addis Ababa or, in Juba, and then young people are always at front line. So for us to showcase this to the world, we needed, the young people ourselves, to come up and show that we can't just be used for violence. We are actually equal partners for peace that can present real ideas. And these are the 3 motivations that, not just me, but my fellow young people came up with the idea that, let's have an initiative.
I mean, it's incredible. Tell us about the actual work on the ground that the youth in the camp have been able to undertake under the work of you and YSAT. Can you talk us through some of the programs that you're running and the work you're doing on the ground, John?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, what started as an advocacy group in 2016, I was registered, of course, officially in 2017 as a refugee-led community-based organization. Much of our work was on advocacy, was on training youth as peace champions or peace educators, trying to look at early warning and early signs of violence. But then in the wake of localization, we move on to from peace building. We have programs on general food assistance that is supporting refugees, supporting World Food Program and Andrea Food International in distributing foods to the local communities, where we lead the community mobilization and sensitization. That was before the COVID pandemic, because this is a small refugee-led organization. You don't trust them with your money, so they have to do community mobilization. They have to do, sensitization, sharing the food log and all that. And then we, of course, continued with our peace building work. When pandemic started, we saw our roles moving faster. And, with the lockdown and the restriction of majority of partners not able to deliver the assistance, we became an option to go to because of our presence. So we were in WASH, where we were making personal protective equipment, we were making masks and distributing to the communities, especially the frontline workers and also the food distribution centers, casual laborers. And then apart from the food distribution, we also distribute soap and hand washing facilities. And we ran also an entrepreneurship program called Refugee Youth Entrepreneurship Challenge, which is a social enterprise that connects ideas and action. Because when we look at young people being trained as peace educators, when they leave the violent mentality, when they come out from the conflict zone, what next? The question is, where do you leave us here? They need to be more engaged, that they don't even have time to fall back to violence. So our programs are mostly on the peaceful coexistence and the livelihood activities, where we are giving multipurpose cash grant through the support of Oxfam. This is to new arrivals, youth who have just come, who have lost everything. You need to settle and start life afresh. So we give an equivalent of, I don't know, it should be like $10 because it is 37,000 Uganda shilling. It probably roughly is like $10 for someone to settle in for a month, in addition to the food that maybe you get from WP, which is 70% cut by 30%. Yeah. So basically, these are some of the programs that we are doing in the settlement. I want everyone listening to know that from my presentations, refugee-led organizations like us started on a very light note, just because of that trust, just because of that capacity gap, and then moving on when the pandemic came in. I think it shows our relevance. It shows why we should be partners that we work with an INGO or with the UN agencies. And so then our work began to expand. We can now say we are in WASH programs, we are in protection, and then also we are in livelihood support for refugees.
John, we will have so many questions for you, and I really want to try and keep this tight because I know we've got 60 people here who've tuned in specifically to speak to the young leaders like yourself. So thank you so much, and I'm going to go to Najiba now, and we'll come back to John in the questions. Najiba, are you here to join us?
Yes, I am.
Well, it's a pleasure to introduce you. Najiba is Najiba Vazifadost is the founder of Global Refugee Network and the Asia Pacific Network of Refugees, and she's joining us today from Sydney. Najiba was born in Iran and came to Australia via Indonesia on a boat. And Najiba has been actively involved in the development of refugee-led networks at both the regional and the global level. She focuses on bringing together refugee-led organizations and refugee change makers from around the world together to discuss their lived experiences and to propose solutions for more effective and sustainable refugee policy. Najiba, thanks again. Now, you've really described what's been happening as a participation revolution. Tell us, what do you mean by a participation revolution?
It's a good question. And every time I actually reflect on where I was about 10 to 15 years ago when I actually wanted to advocate for refugee matters, things were quite different to today. For many years, a lot of refugees, just like Mushkan and John, we came together to lobby and negotiate really with policymakers, UN agencies and governments at different levels, at local, regional and international level. And all we were asking was really for meaningful refugee participation. We wanted to be engaged. We wanted to be involved basically around the decisions that were being made about us. As we all know, refugees are often the first and the last responders to any crisis. They're the leaders for innovative integration efforts. They serve as resources, and we just saw it again from the presentation of Joan and Mushgan, to other refugees, but also to the host community when it comes to policy change, gaps and best practices. But most often, initially, when I start advocating for refugees at a very early young age, starting from Australia at local and national level, I started to realize that not necessarily those decisions that were being made about us were including our voices. I realized that often excluding refugees were not really leading to sustainable or effective refugee policies. So for us, meaningful refugee participation, what exactly it means in terms, we wanted to be in the room. Yes, of course, this is what we desired. But we didn't want it to be just simply a box where everybody would tick and say, yeah, refugees are involved, refugees are engaged, they're not part of the policy-making decision. What we wanted is that refugee participation in refugee policy making to be really a norm and not really the exception. And we wanted, a refugee lens to be implemented and adapted in programs, in budgets and activities, in everything that was related in relation to refugees being designed or implemented. Meaningful refugee participation often, in the first years of my advocacy, was really about representing them at conferences and using them as storytellers. We weren't necessarily utilizing refugees as people with experts, as people with skills, as people being professional, as people as, equal developers and equal assets to the activities that we were doing. So what we tried to do is really to engage in policy discussion in order to bring our expertise and all our different critical stories from the ground to international decision makers. To connect those affected by policies to the shapers of those policies. We wanted a participation revolution, a human-centered design approach to the refugee policy making, and without a space for these stories and experiences, no policy discussion was going to be as meaningful as refugees needed to work together with governments, with NGOs, with private sectors, with donors and other stakeholders to make sure that, our engagement, our participation is not tokenistic, it's actually realistic, and we are being looked as equal stakeholders. The road ahead still remains very challenging. And again, we have made faraway efforts. For the first time, it was just a month ago during the UNHCR NGO consultation, the UNHCR High Commissioner, Filippo Grandi, made a clear statement, a dialogue which I was also involved as a speaker with him. We were able to talk about the impacts that refugee-led initiatives have made during the pandemic. And it was the first time that we were actually giving a clear recognition to the work that refugees have been doing. It's not that this is the first time we are actually acting as responders to the crisis, but often our work is not recognized or hasn't been recognized. And it was great to see that. And I think, when I talk about participation revolution, is how we were really used as storytellers, and slowly we are start making much more representation, a diversified representation of refugees start becoming more visible. For example, now we have Joan from camp and we have Mujgan from Indonesia, and this wasn't the case. It was more around, what is much more easier to showcase, what's much more easier to tick the box. And we have made a great effort in bringing, at least a change in the language. Refugee-led organization was a very new terminology back in 2004 when I attended Geneva. Nobody had much idea about what do we mean by refugee-led initiatives. Who are they? How can we trust them? Are they legitimate? Are they representative? Are they recognizable? Are they accountable? Are they responsible? But we've been able to really respond to those questions and say why our participation is important, and what we are working now is how we can make that participation meaningful. And that's what I call participation revolution.
Well, I'm glad we've had this revolution, and I'm glad that you and Mushkan and John are leading it. Tell me about that cultural change in big organizations, like the UNHCR. How difficult has it been to encourage that deep cultural change and really get them to embrace refugee-led approaches?
Sophie, it's a very good question. It has been a very difficult question for us to actually bring conversation about. There is still a lot to be shared and exchanged, not only with donors, but also with international community, including INGOs and stakeholders. What I could say from my experience in the past few years working with a lot of refugee-led initiatives in the Asia region as well as globally, that our current aid system is not necessarily inclusive of refugees. And just in our recent consultation that we did with refugee communities in Cox's Bazar, the lack of finance was seen as one of the main, the lack of finance and investment was seen as one of the main barriers to their participation. Refugees and refugee-led initiatives, they face a lot of challenges, and Mujgan just mentioned one. In Indonesia, a lot of refugee-led initiatives are not able to register. They're not able to have bank accounts, and that inability becomes a barrier to their participation. And with that, we don't have enough funding or grants making that provides that flexibility to refugee-led initiatives. Donors really need to focus on the specific needs of refugees as a primary objective, not really as an afterthought. Funding refugee-led initiatives should not always be about success. And most often when we talk to donors or UN agencies or NGOs, it's all about, the success, but it can also carry failure. But it still could be inspiring, no matter the outcome, the fund can still achieve a lot of important things in a way that it will still allow refugees to grow and develop, building their own confidence and innovating problem-solving skills. Most often we hear from donors and again from NGOs and stakeholders around a valuable investment. And sometimes I wonder, what does it mean, a valuable investment? And when we talk to refugee-led initiatives, the same question arises. How do we define a fair environment when it comes to humanitarian aid, when it comes to budget and funding? I would say it comes down to people. If you're investing, we should not only be investing in the projects, we should be really investing in the people that are implementing them. And if we use this angle and lens, then we are able to create much more flexible funding opportunity. It's very important that in the absence of political leverage, especially in the Asia region where we work with a lot of refugee-led initiatives, there is a real absence of political leverage. So this is where we actually rely on donors to bring that economic leverage that can really work to create change and bring that leverage in leadership and funding, from donors to ensure that there is a direct line of support to refugee-led initiatives. We should explore new models of giving. Refugees-Led campaign is one example and one excellent model that has shown, how if we are able to support a refugee-led initiative directly, the impact could be way, way bigger, and so what I would say is that, let's explore for better and newer models of giving and adapt a refugee lens to our approach of funding and aid to our future aid as well.
Najeeba, thank you so much. I'm sure we're going to hear more from you later. I'm sure people have questions for you. Before we open up for questions, I'm just going to quickly go back to Anna Crowley from the Open Society Foundations. Anna, just before we go to questions, could you just outline for us the role that donors can play in shifting this power to refugee-led groups? What advice can you give to us, Anna?
Sure. Thanks, Sophie. And I think I'll step back one level before answering the question directly, because I think Mojgan and Najeeba have sort of answered it already, and John as well, what donors can do to leverage influence. But I think it's important to reflect on the moment we're in terms of refugee policy and protection globally. We're at what could be considered an all-time low, and a lot of our strategy at Open Society Foundations is predicated on the idea that the system as it was designed to support and protect refugees is not fit for purpose. And rather than be despondent about this, we actually take it as an opportunity to recreate and re-envision. And at the center of that re-envisioning, we see refugees as not participants, but as driving forces and decision makers in any reform to the system. And that's what we're ultimately working toward. I think the other big picture thought that I'll begin with is the refugee sector is way behind other sectors. This is largely due to the way the humanitarian establishment works, but it's behind the development sector in terms of how it gets funding to grassroots and local groups, how it facilitates community action. And so there's a lot of catch up that we have to do, and donors, especially donors who straddle the refugee space and other spaces, have a critical role to play in doing that. So what role specifically can donors play? This, as I mentioned, the other panelists have covered it quite well. We have a big role to play in how we deploy funding. It signals values and can create incentives to change behavior. The behavior we want to change is that of other grantees and partners of ours who can serve as better allies and partners in engaging refugees and refugee-led groups. It could be bigger institutional actors, in this case, UNHCR and bilateral donors, who can create funding streams. specifically to facilitate refugee leadership and ensure certain quotas for parts of their big funding to go to refugee-led groups. Or the target can be other philanthropies who we want to bring along to create additional leverage and develop a critical mass of support for refugee leadership. We can also have influence in how we create space for refugee-led partners to make their own decisions in the context of their partnerships with us. This shifts power and ownership to them. We can give refugee leaders more time by simplifying procedures and making things easier. We've employed intermediaries' help in resolving registration issues, in giving context-specific legal advice, or even supporting reporting and accounting. Because if you give people back time and human capital to actually exercise influence over decision-making, they'll be more readily able to do so without losing the legitimacy that allows them to be so effective in their communities. And then the last point I'll make is about funding flexibly, directly and flexibly, with a focus on leadership. This is something that Jiva and Mushkan have said. Flexible funding allows refugee-led groups to develop both the stability and time to develop capacities. And it can also include really important elements of capacity support that are based on strengthening those capacities refugee-led organizations have, rather than, you know, training them up to do the kind of reporting that we might expect. So like Najiba said, it's really about shifting expectations about what's needed of refugee-led groups and carving out space for them to be refugee-led groups and have an equal role in the system, not to be sort of proto-implementers of standard humanitarian policy.
Thanks, Anna. Now we want to make sure we get as many questions as we can, so please throw them in the Q&A box or the chat box. I've already got one here, but I've only got one, so please send a few more in. The first question by an anonymous attendee, what is being done to ensure that refugee-led organisations that aren't led by English-speaking refugees are able to participate in policy discussions and to access funding? Mushkan, would you like to start with that one? In terms of the community you work with and the numbers there, how are people who don't speak English, how are they able to participate in policy discussions and access funding, or is it just not an option in the community where you're working at the moment? Is that part of what needs the funding?
Well, the community that I'm working in, there are about 15 different refugee-led organizations, which most of them are learning centers and schools, and a center for women specifically, which there are refugee leaders that are not English speaking or not perfectly, you know, English speakers, but they're leading really great programs. What we have done to overcome this is we created a refugee network within, you know, our own community. And, you know, we all have interpreters to make sure that everybody can participate and all the messages will come across. So within the network, we work together, we support each other, and so far nobody has been left behind.
Perfect. John, what about you? Not everyone where you live would speak English. How do you ensure that the work you do and the relationships you have with donors, how do you ensure that the wants and needs of everyone is accounted for and that their wishes are communicated to the donor community?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sophie, and for the colleague who asked the question. You know, diversity is very important in what we're doing, and we have seen this representation a lot with refugee-led organizations. I want to acknowledge this, that in Uganda we have, I think, over 40 refugee-led organizations, and they speak different languages, you know, French and English and others. Well, as my colleague mentioned, the refugee-led network in Uganda, who is led by my colleague Robert Akiza and the colleagues, does a lot of integration of all these languages, because then we speak as refugee-led organizations, not just one. But for the local communities, we have a network of community-based mobilizers, because then the idea is we get someone within your community who is the contact point for partners coming into your village, partners coming into your zone or coming into your settlement. So the issue of translation means that we get people who are based there, who are trusted by their people and who speak the same language, the network that we have. We have over 30 community-based mobilizers who are spread across the settlement where we work, and they speak different languages across. And so this is how we always make sure that when they are going for post-distribution monitoring, when they're going for any evaluation, when there's a consultations, it is the local person on ground that is speak for the community and with the community, but not just someone outside representing our ideas.
Najeeba, is this an example of why the refugee-led organizations are, it seems so obvious they should be at the front, but they haven't been. But is this an example because they have that amazing ability to consult in a way that others can't, because you have the language skills, because you're actually in the community, from the community? Can you talk us through the kind of consultation that a refugee-led initiative has possible? Can you tell us about that, Najeeba?
I mean, first of all, I do need to say that not being able to speak English is a barrier and can become quite difficult, especially we're living in a very westernized world. All the donors, all the NGOs, and most of the stakeholders that we do communicate, English is probably the language that we use. So sometimes for me as a resettled refugee, I definitely see that as a privilege to myself, but I try to remind myself that I use that privilege positively. Whereas when it comes to working with NGOs and donors and other stakeholders, I think it's the same kind of reminder that we will come across local actors that would not necessarily speak the same language. I mean, communication itself, in many of the consultation that we did with communities, with refugee communities, is considered as aid. So it's very, very important that we are able to share information in a timely manner with refugee communities. And when it comes to that, we do have challenges, and that becomes a language. And John just referred to translation as an issue. But what I can say is that we can actually become very innovative. The issue right now is that we are most often stuck with our traditional ways of doing things. For example, most of the consultations that are happening around the region or globally are often done in English. I'm going to give you two examples as to how we became much more innovative in an English world that we're dealing with. Just about a few weeks ago, we actually did a consultation with Rohingya refugee communities from Cox's Bazar. And we knew that, internet could be an issue. We knew that language could be an issue, but we didn't give up on them. We wanted to make sure that their voice and their participation is supported. I mean, one thing that I can say for sure before I actually give the example is that we're not here to say that we are representative of all refugee groups. That is out of our capacity, but we try to be as representative. We try to bring a diversified participation by refugees. In terms of the Rohingya consultation, we actually took a very different approach to a lot of the NGOs. We actually had to go through 3 different steps. One, we had to establish a WhatsApp group and ensure that there was a Rohingya translator within the WhatsApp group. Second, we had to use voice messages as a way of providing each other's input. And those voice messages took more than 2 weeks for us to put together and to put it into a collaboration. Third, we need to ensure that there is enough resources and investment that if those that could come to a face-to-face virtual consultation through Zoom or other alternatives, they had resources, and that means they had some incentive to provide them transport, to provide them internet access, and that at least reduced some of the other barriers if language was still an issue and translator could actually fit that. So what I'm trying to say is that when it comes to communication, we definitely need to see it itself as an aid, and we need to treat it in many other and we need to get out of our traditional norms of the way we do it. For example, right now we're in Zoom and we're speaking in English, and it could be very easy, but that's not the case with refugees. And I think one other thing that I can say, especially when I talk about consultations, we need to also ensure that refugee participation is not really limited to moments of ad hoc consultation, because that doesn't really enable refugees to influence or deeply inform the directions of the responses that impact their lives.
Najeeba, thank you. We didn't have many questions before, but now they're coming in fast and furious. So we'll try and get to a few more. I'll go to you, Mushkan. Could you respond to this question from Linda Fox? What do you believe is the biggest barrier to funders supporting refugee-led organizations? What's your opinion, Mushkan?
I I think the biggest barrier for a lot of organizations is legal registration, and even some organizations having legal registration still doesn't allow them to have bank accounts because it has a whole different requirement, you know, on its own, and it's very challenging. So I think that two are the biggest barriers, but then the third one would be the requirements of the grant applications themselves, like I said before. But you know, so far we have been trying to overcome the first barrier by using INGOs and, you know, other registered entities as mediators to be able to receive the funding on our behalf.
John, what about the biggest barriers for you? What do you think are the biggest barrier for funders supporting a refugee-led organization like yours?
Great. Yeah, I think I like this question because we're talking to a diverse group of people. And I will take this from experience based, okay? I don't want to be biased. Just like what my colleague said, for me, I think the biggest barrier is trust. Trust because we've seen a lot of well-established refugee-led organizations who are there, who are giving aid. But then the question that some donors keep asking is, but do we trust them with our money? Are they registered? Even when we are registered, what about the human resource? Do they have skills personnel? People begin to question this even when they don't reach us, you know, and this is trust, I call it. I give an example. When I said earlier this year, when we were working with World Food Program, and we were being given a very small task. And also we work with Oxfam, and you know, our work has been only around peace building. When we want to get a bigger grant, they will say, okay, will they manage it? Are they not going to have issues with our funds, even when they know our capacity is there? So I think the issue of trust has to be built. And any donor in this panel should ask themselves, what is the good enough policy that determines that, okay, now we can trust this entity? It is not there. And as long as there is no good enough policy that says this partner is okay, I feel the barrier is the trust. And if we can engage. Another example is with the Canada High Commission. Last year we applied through the Canada Fund for Local Initiative, and we couldn't go through because there were a lot of questions to do with, if this is a new idea, these are refugees themselves, how will they go to a community which is not their community? So we had to prove our diversity until when we receive funds from WP, until when we now get published by UN OSHA, until when we get, nominated for the UN Innovation Award this year, is when now everyone begins to feel like, okay, so what is WISA? Okay, what is YARI? Okay, what is, SESI? What is this organization? What are they doing? And then you find people becoming more interested in our work. So I think if we can deal with trust, if we can give a refugee-led organization space to, showcase the talent they have, and also if we can go with an intent to build capacity, not just implement projects. I think this will help us trust ourselves, because when we trust money, that, okay, this is our money and we'll use it to implement projects, and then it creates a barrier. But when we give money to build up people, just like what my colleague said, and then the trust will build itself up. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant answer, John. Thank you. And I think we've got another room for one more question before we throw to Anna Demont. This is an excellent one. I think you'll like this one too, John. We see non-refugee-led services having paid staff, but refugee-led organisations are assumed to be volunteer-run. So how do we change this culture and recognise the expertise of refugee-led services and ensure that they're fully supported? I'll go to you first, John, and then I'll go to Najeeba and Mushkan.
Me again? Sorry?
So we assume that refugee-led organisations, that they're volunteer-run, but non-refugee-led organisations, we assume that they have paid staff. So how do we change that culture and recognise the expertise that people like yourself have, John?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I want to say that the localization agenda is taking shape, and so we are trying to put together. There is what I will call a test and try funding to a more sustainable funding. Because refugee-led are given $5,000, $3,000 just to test and try something that doesn't come with salary or anything related to staff administration. But I think we have to come to terms with ourselves. My suggestion, and from my experience that we've been doing right now, is that when we are working into partnerships with projects or programming, we should give a full project implementation to refugee-led organizations, because we are the same organizations. Believe me or not, we have organizations like Yarid, who have now worked with UNHCR for over 2 years. We have Kobowas, which has now worked with UNHCR for so long. And so it begins from giving us the same concept note that you would give a non-refugee-led organization. It begins with giving us projects that has all the costs, from the overhead cost, from staff cost, from office running cost, to the direct implementation cost. This way, the idea of changing the narrative of we being voluntary based is by recognizing that we are, standard institutions. Once you recognize that these are institutions that are legally registered, operational, then that means the package of partnership comes fully. It doesn't have to look at the project implementation as a whole, but it looks at full project implementation as it is. That for me, that's how I will look at it. That when we are looking at partnerships, and this has come out very well. I wanted to give the experience of us working now with World Program, where they have our staffing, where they have now our overhead costs. But that did not start from the beginning. But it started when they began to trust us. It started when they began to see our relevance, why it was important when other organizations were not present in the refugee settlement, we were there. And then when we also had to sit down on the round table and discuss, they realized we have the same human resource, qualified people with papers that, can enter the same payroll that a Ugandan would do. So I think recognizing the partnership principles, to me, would help us make sure we balance this inequality.
Thanks, John. Just before we throw back to Anna Mushgan, what's your perspective on this? How do we change that culture around the assumption that a refugee-led service is volunteer-run? How do you respond to that?
Well, in our experience, it has also been an issue. Like we are seeing foreign partners coming into refugee-led organizations and being hired as a staff and being paid like 5-10 times more than a refugee would. And usually they try to go around the law by saying that these are allowances that are being paid to refugees, but of course it's a very, very small amount comparing to anything that you could call a salary. But then the amount of the work that these refugee leaders are doing is equal, if not more, than what foreign partners are coming in and playing. And the barrier really is the government's not allowing refugees to be paid here, but there are many gaps in the law that through our entities and through the registrations, we can have legal representatives to, receive the funding on our behalf. Or we could, create a role for the refugee person to be able to get paid, saying most of the funding comes from outside of the country and there's no barrier on receiving funding from outside or working online. What is a barrier really in Indonesia specifically is working in the country and like taking Indonesians' jobs and local people's jobs, which is not a case in here, so totally, if the grant allows it, then refugee-led organizations can allocate salaries to refugee leaders or anyone else who is managing the programs. It is totally possible to do. It's only the question of, does the grant allow it or not?
And changing that culture to ensure it's valued, that expertise. Well, I'm just going to throw now to Anna Dumont from Planet Wheeler Foundation and the Australian International Development Network, the AIDN, to wrap up and to thank all of our panelists. Anna, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Wow, what a panel. I've really, really enjoyed this, and I hope everyone listening has too. Sophie, I'd like to thank you very much for your facilitation today. You'll all recognise Sophie. I'm sure she's a much celebrated and loved Australian investigative journalist, television presenter and author, and is now the Australia researcher for Human Rights Watch. Sophie, we're delighted that you're part of the sector. There's a strong theme throughout Sophie's work of creating a platform for the stories of people forced to flee their home because of persecution, abuse or conflict. So yeah, it was great to have you along today.
It was an honour to meet and talk to these young leaders. Thanks.
Yeah, that's been wonderful. We'll actually be putting a link in the follow-up. So tomorrow there'll be a number of links sent round to you all. And one of the links will be Sophie's interview with Rahaf Mohammed, the teenager from Saudi Arabia who sought asylum and found it in Canada and there's a remarkable interview there between Rahaf and Sophie that I hope you will all check out if you haven't before. And also to note that Sophie's just published her first book, We Can't Say We Didn't Know, Dispatches from an Age of Impunity, which was shortlisted for the 2020 Walkley Book Award, to add to the many awards that Sophie's won throughout her career. So thanks, Sophie, that was wonderful. Now some thanks to other people, most of all to our panelists today for leading from where you are, whether it's in the Rhino refugee camp of Uganda like John, from a state of limbo in Jakarta like Mojgan, quite remarkable, or indeed as someone granted protection in Australia like Najiba, in Sydney, but continuing to create opportunities for those who don't know what the future holds. I'd also like to acknowledge some of our guests and people watching today. There are some remarkable people in the Australian refugee sector who have been great collaborators and really understanding that with great privilege comes great responsibility, and creating solidarity with refugee leaders. And I know Najiba will probably be nodding her head at that. So people like people in the Refugee Council of Australia, Refugee Legal, Human Rights Law Centre and others, many. And so thank you for your leadership so far as well. And on that note, Anna Crowley, thank you for also living that adage that you've got a great privilege in your position, you're really living out the responsibility that comes with that and leading change. Sophie, once again, delighted you're part of the human rights community, and thank you for being our facilitator today. And a huge thanks to Julie Rosenberg and the Aiden Network for committing to the voices of local leaders. Julie wants there to be more of these kind of events, and she's been doing a fantastic job leading the Australian International Development Network, which I'm really pleased to be a part of. We will circulate links to this network, Aiden, and to some exciting video, and not least of which the podcast hosted by Mojgan, co-hosted by Mojgan, which, as Sophie said, is really worth checking out. So we'll be sending through links, and we'd like to thank you all for attending today. And please do get in touch if you have an interest in joining this movement towards refugee leadership in our region. It takes all of us, and we will be having some follow-up, so please get in touch and follow the links that we'll send through tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.